So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the session. This is the new era of protocol-based property transaction that will be delivered by Todd Miller. He is the VP of Business and Partnership Development at ChromaWay. Guys, ChromaWay is a sponsor on this program, and their support is very essential for us to keep doing events like this. And give you a brief heads up, ChromaWay is an innovative blockchain software company with offices in Stockholm, Kiev, Tel Aviv, and Washington, D.C. ChromaWay has in blockchain and smart contract technologies to companies and government entities in the US, Canada, Europe, South America, Australia, and India itself. Its public blockchain platform, Chromia, is hosting dApps across the gaming, DeFi, financial services, and real estate sectors. So I think I'll be able to give you more information. Todd, I hand over the stage to you. I will be backstage if you need anything.
Great.
Thank you so much for being part of the program today.
Okay, so Ross, thanks so much for the conference, and it's been great partnering with you on this really exciting topic. I'm just going to share a screen here and go through some. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Okay, 1 second. I assume that everyone can see this. So again, good to be here. I'm in Washington, D.C., so it's a bit earlier in the morning. I think it's around 7:30, but it's nice. I know there are people from sort of across the globe here, so it's a nice opportunity to chat with people. So here's what I'll cover today. Talk a little bit about myself and my background in ChromaWay, so I kind of get to know you virtually. Talk about sort of the changing landscape of property transactions. There is a lot of evolution going on right now. We can see it based on the topics of the conference. And I want to talk about one of those areas, which are called decentralized protocols or the blockchain. I'll talk about a few case studies that we're working on. Surprise mentioned we work around the world. People may be familiar with some of the work we've done in Sweden with the Swedish Land Registry. We've also worked actually in India, in Andhra Pradesh, on a modest project there, in Australia and some other places. I'll talk most sort of focus on some of the recent work we're doing in Latin America with the Inter-American Development Bank. And then hopefully we'll have some chance for some Q&A. So first of all, just about me, I've been with ChromaWay since 2017. I focus a lot of my time on the property and real estate segment. I kind of call myself like the VP of use cases, because I think we're in this period right now where the real estate industry, other domains are still trying to sort of understand how blockchain and the technology can sort of fit into their business. So given sort of my domain background, this sort of helps facilitate that discussion. I was with Fannie Mae before joining ChromaWay. This is the big securitization and secondary market maker in the U.S. around U.S. mortgages. And then just a little personal thing about myself, I'm running all 50 states. So you can see I've colored in most of the states. If you're a runner, you'll sympathize with running a marathon and so forth. But it's a good way to stay in shape as we're sort of navigating the blockchain also. Just briefly about ChromaWay, launched in 2016. So that actually makes us one of the more experienced blockchain projects, more of the veteran projects. For folks who have been involved in blockchain, you may be familiar with this colored coin technology. Our CTO, who is Alex Mizrahi, was one of the protocol developers of that. And that was actually one of the first efforts to root a non-crypto asset in the Bitcoin blockchain. So actually it's sort of coming full circle with using other types of asset types, such as real estate. Our blockchain is called Chromia. It's based on something we call relational blockchain technology, which is relational databases. This makes them more scalable and faster transaction times. We use a combination of proof of authority and proof of stake, not proof of work, which is much more energy and efficient, of course. So far, as mentioned, we're headquartered in Stockholm, but we have offices here in DC, in Tel Aviv, and our tech centers in Kiev. And we're actually a general blockchain company. We work across gaming, NFTs, DeFi, government, but we do have this specialty in sort of real estate. We were named last year the fastest growing overall tech company in Sweden. And given Sweden's tech environment, we're very proud of that association. Okay, so just about some of the projects. We're working with the Inter-American Development Bank on a project called Latin America Caribbean Property Chain, and I'll talk more about that as an example. And then, interestingly, many of those protocols that we've been able to develop in the sort of the real world also poured over to the virtual world. So when you see a lot of attention around NFTs and in property sales, whether they be in games or different types of virtual worlds, that allows us to test and scale around transactions, around ownership of assets, around trading of assets in that virtual world. So that's also been a very helpful experience to us. And these land sales, even in the virtual world, have been very successful. And we're actually working with some set of developers around crossing those two worlds. And would love to talk about that another time. So let's talk about protocols. What is a protocol? I mean, essentially, it's a predefined set of rules. In this case, it's enforced by code on the blockchain, and it really dictates how the blockchain network might work, right? So, if we stop for a second here, we can think about protocols and the blockchain in sort of two ways. First of all, if we think about the world we live in today, which is mostly around applications like Facebook or Twitter or Google, or even from a property perspective, like a multi-listing service, most of the value is in the application itself. And it's also in the data that's stored in that application. But most of the value is going to go to those single entities who are behind that application. The protocol layer, and we can think of that as HTTPS on the internet or SMTP for email, that helps traffic data around a network. But the real value add is more proprietary within those application layers. Some people will call it sort of a walled garden. But what's happening now is with blockchain networks is the protocol layer and these decentralized nodes, which are essentially decentralized databases, becomes much more important because the protocol layer allows many entities to take advantage of interoperability with each other, interoperability with such entities, as I'll discuss momentarily, with like the property registry. And these decentralized nodes store the data in a way that's more transparent, that prevents fraud, that allows for reuse of data. The DApp, or the distributed application, is still important, but where the real value is the network, and that becomes a broader value for the community. And again, if we go one more layer down, we think of like two dimensions of blockchain protocols. There's the protocol around the ledger of data, the blockchain itself. And we hear a lot about consensus algorithms and data validation and the mechanism to store data in the blockchain in a consensus way. But what's really interesting for property transactions, I think, is around the input mechanism, meaning how do we get data into the blockchain? And I'll use an example in a second about how a property registry is essentially a ledger, and the way we get data into it is maybe what we can focus more on. And in the work we're doing with property registries around the world, we tend to focus more on the input mechanism. And we use something called a smart contract, which is a codified process or mechanism for routing data into a blockchain network that multiple parties can use. And it's a little bit of an analogy we can use between, for example, a bank which has a vault. In that vault are assets. This one has gold and currency. The assets are in the bank, but to a certain degree, what's is as important about what's in the vault is how they get into the vault or how they get onto the ledger. And that's really the input protocol. In this case, it could be a truck. In most cases, we're talking about electronic means of getting data in there. But if we use this metaphor for what is the ledger of data about the asset, and it could be a real estate asset, a property title, and what's the mechanism for modifying that asset or modifying those accounts, that's what is interesting about the protocol that I think we want to focus on. And let's talk about a property transaction. Okay, so if you look at most property ecosystems today around the world, and there isn't that much variation, as it turns out. You have cadastral agencies who do mapping. You have property users, property owners, property developers, businesses, and you have a set of service providers who are there to sort of facilitate the navigation or the process of modifying or establishing a title or a property record. And if you look at it, abstract it out to its essential part, the property registry is a ledger of data. And I would argue here that a notary or an attorney, could be a conveyancer in different countries, is the input mechanism, meaning that the notary has sort of a single-threaded power over how that data is modified in the registry. And I would argue that today's system is very non-transparent, and because of the role of usually individual parties, it's single-threaded and therefore very vulnerable to fraud on one hand, but more importantly, the process becomes slow and inefficient and costly. The reason it's becoming more important today is because really COVID, in a way, has accelerated digital conveyance or digital property transactions. We're working in Peru with the Inter-American Development Bank, I think I mentioned. And here you can see a diagram or a chart of the growth in digital transactions to the property registry. And you can see up until the end of 2019, 2020, the beginning of COVID, there were very few digital transactions. But starting in 2020, because of COVID and because of the fact that the registry would not allow in-person submissions, they were allowed to send the transaction in digitally. The problem with that is that it simply became a PDF and signed and posted to the portal of the registry. So even though digitization is sort of accelerating, the form of that makes it vulnerable to not only fraud, but more importantly, a sort of lack of understanding by the registry about what goes into those claims. And so, I just have a sort of an example here today. This is an example of let's say it's a property subdivision, which is a very common process in property systems. And you might have a property owner, a surveyor, a bank, a cadastral authority that does the mapping. But as I noted before, the participants who are in this process, and I know there's a lot of people who are with us today, sort of know this, that they don't really know status of or the state of the transaction. The registry also has no view into the provenance of the transaction. They're really dependent on the notary or their conveyancer to vouch for the integrity of the data. And so the notary often represents the entire process, but is really not the main actor, meaning the surveyor is the one that does the property plan. The cadastral authority may confirm it. The bank may talk about what liens they have. There's also no standard input mechanism, meaning there's a deed typically or other documentation, but it varies, by state, by type of transaction, and so forth, by notary. So what's the solution here? How can we address this? And these are sort of, and how are we addressing this? And we have a concept that's called hybrid smart contracts. And so we took the smart contract concept, which is a, self-executing code representing a transaction, and we tried to address this process. It's an open source protocol. It's based on a standard process. So this means that once a process is mapped around mortgage discharge or a property transfer, it can be reused as a library. The compliance with law is actually codified within the smart contract, within the code. So if the law says that you need certain signatures or certain data, you can configure that within the code. There's also a workflow among participants, and those participants could be people or machines. And it's also, that's workflow is used to order the transactions. So if a property owner needs to initiate the transaction and it needs to go to, say, a bank first, you can order that within the this hybrid smart contract. All actions are digitally signed and notarized. So this way, by the time it gets to the property registry or it gets to any other participant, they can see who signed it and so forth. And the interesting concept here is that instead of a single entity providing the notarization, such as a notary or a conveyancer, the network is actually providing the audit trail and providing consensus notarization over the integrity of the claim against the property registry. And here I have a left is just sort of a snippet of a smart contract. It's in very simple language. In red, buyer, bank receives the purchase, sends the contract to the land registry. You can see where signatures are required and so forth. So it's a very accessible type of code and so forth. So it can be read by attorneys, used by analysts. That's the sort of back end of it. But for the front end of it, it's very simple. And I apologize, this is actually in Spanish because it's being used in Latin America. But you can see here, this Juan Carlos Quiroga is the property owner. And this is actually a mortgage discharge transaction. But you can see on the right, pasos de proceso is the process steps that I mentioned before that have been mapped into the smart contract. So as the steps are executed, as the property owner requests the bank to do the mortgage discharge, the bank then may notify the property owner notifies the notary, and so forth. It's checkmarked off on the user interface. But behind the scenes, all this data and all the signatures are being saved to the blockchain. And that can be used, the data from the blockchain can be used as an audit trail. One of the advantages here is that we can use the blockchain infrastructure to support these property transactions. So you can see here that I have my application that the users are using at the bottom, but around it, I can reuse our vault or wallet, which allows users to sign in with identity. They can also use their tokens. In the LAC property chain case, we're using tokens as the internal settlement model, and that can go out into escrow. And then they can check on the blockchain for if the transactions have been executed properly. So it provides the transparency. So this just to sort of end here, I mean, these protocol-based property transactions, we're using them across many different types of transaction types. I talked today about conveyance transactions, liens or transfers, but they can be used in property development, such as permitting and so forth, where you have multiple parties, in commercial real estate, such as establishing SPVs. And now we're focusing more on fractional investing and tokenization of real estate, using these sort of same underlying concepts to be able to not only move to the claim against the property record, but also the underlying ownership of that property. So that was a lot, but hope to talk to you some more. We're over at we have a booth, and you can reach out to me directly. Happy to, if we have a couple minutes, to answer some questions also.
Thank you, Todd, for your presentation. I think I'm seeing a lot of comments that this presentation is really inspiring and new to them. And people are asking about the presentation. So if you can send me a sanitized version of the presentation in a PDF format. So what we do is after the event, we share them with all the attendees. So, they can study them and go this thing. I think one question from Teresa Kennedy. Is this a private company or government run?
So ChromaWay is a private company, but Chromia, our blockchain, is a public entity run by a foundation. So the blockchain is public, and ChromaWay works with different partners to help build these distributed applications for property and other domains on the Chromia blockchain. So.
Okay, so I think that was the question, and I think the point which you mentioned about the property registration and the title registration, I think it's very important. If you were listening into the panel session before, Mr. Niranjan mentioned that he himself, in his family, they have seen a case where they bought a property and the registry was not proper, and it was a mess. So I think there is a lot of scope for your applications in India, and I'm sure you'll be able to connect to many developers out here. Let me see. There's one more question by Teresa again. Will deeds offices be using this or blockchain company?
I'm sorry, maybe Safaz, you could repeat that, or any.
Will deeds offices be using this or blockchain companies?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify here, there's different ways to implement this technology, and we're actually bigger advocates for these protocols to be built in partnership with the deeds office or the registries, but they can be built independently by a consortium, by a private vendor. All that is really required is that the property registry accept the protocol or the interface or the data that's being provided through the protocol. So for example, in Latin America and Peru, this is being built by a consortium of banks. The Inter-American Development Bank is funding it, but it's almost a private public partnership where the transactions are developed within the private sector because that's where the dealings are, but they're accepted as valid by the property registry. So,
one more question from Marina. I think she's from Fiapchi in the US. And are there any potential impacts of the recording ownership of properties?
Well, I mean, we think, and I tried to present that in the presentation, that this provides a more secure process for ensuring the integrity of title records and of recording. Because today, there's a lot of focus on sort of the title records themselves. And again, going back to my bank analogy, how do assets get into the bank? Is it through an unsecured truck, or is it through a secured process which has a lot of transparency? So we think like that the title process and the chain of the title will be much clearer because we have this auditable trail on the blockchain, and we don't have to upset the current role of the registry around we don't need to put title records directly on the blockchain. We can put the process to get those records and have the title or the deeds office make the final determination. So.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Thank you so much for your presentation today. And
nice. Thanks so much.
Sure. And if